What is needed now is a gospel-inspired boldness that refuses to be silent and speaks out in a strong, loving voice to call the church to justice in its own life. These words could have been written this morning, but in fact are a quote from Bill Callahan in 1975. Unfortunately, 40 years later, we are still suffering from a lack of injustice in the church's own life. Ordaining women is, of course, intimately connected to this and a grievous manifestation of this injustice, but other aspects of injustice also call us to speak out in strong, loving voices. As Mary Hunt pointed out yesterday morning, the marginalization of women, whether in priesthood or elsewhere, reinforces structures of inequality and injustice of many sorts. One of the stated aims of this WOW 2015 conference is to demonstrate the interconnection between the exclusion of women in ministry and the global damage the church does to the status and treatment of women and girls. So, this morning we are privileged to have with us 4 courageous women who will tell their stories of intolerable injustice, but also of wrongs righted, lives restored, and hope infused because of gospel-inspired boldness that refuses to be silent. Please be aware that some of the accounts you are about to hear may evoke an emotional response, but they will also inspire you, because abuse of power is meeting its match in strong, loving voices like Barbara Blaine on my far right, Mari Steed next to me here, Virginia Saldana here, and Shannon Dd Williams at my far left. And we will begin our panel discussion this morning with Barbara Blaine, the founder and president of Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, a national advocacy group for survivors of clerical sexual abuse. Barbara?
Thank you to all of you who are here to listen and for all the love and support that you have provided for myself and for other survivors over the years. So let me begin by telling you that I was in the 5th or 6th grade when I started saying that I was going to become a priest. It was the 60s, and Vatican II influences were bringing about exciting changes in my world, which evolved around our parish church and school. My dad supported my vocation to priesthood and spoke about how his daughter was going to become one of the first female priests. And back then, with so many other changes of renewal, it seemed not only possible, but likely that women would soon be ordained. In the 7th grade, our pastor chose me to become one of his deaconettes. This was for 7th and 8th grade girls, and we did all the odd jobs and cleaned up around the parish and prepared the bulletins for the weekends. And he had been hearing my requests and complaints that because I was a girl, I could not be an altar server. And that's why he set up this special designation of the deaconettes. I resented that I, as a girl, was not permitted the same opportunities as the boys. As was so often the case, as a girl, I could do the preparation work and the dirty jobs. But it was the boys who were the ones up on the altar getting the right to be right there, to ring the bells as the bread and the wine were blessed. So on one Saturday, there was a special mass for an anniversary, and the boys failed to show up to serve the mass. And I and another deaconette, we had already gotten the altar prepared and ready for the mass, and the pastor was annoyed that the boys didn't come, and so he let us girls serve mass. And that was in 1968. It was within those following months that the assistant pastor began to sexually violate me. I couldn't tell, and I didn't tell. It went on for many years. It shattered my world and my self-esteem. It ripped dreams and hope from my soul, and it filled me with shame and guilt and disdain for my femininity. He led me to believe it was my fault. My becoming a woman made me irresistible. But just remember, I was 12. How much of a woman could I have been? But something bad in me was causing this holy priest to sin, and I hated being female. In my late 20s, I found myself living in a community with homeless families at St. Elizabeth Catholic Worker House in Chicago. And besides the wonderful community and the amazing guests and the endless work, two significant things stand out from that decade that I lived at the Catholic Worker. The first was that I was triggered about my own sexual abuse and violence by the NCR articles about priests sexually abusing altar boys. And the other incident or experience was from a group from the seminary who used to volunteer at our Catholic Worker House. And one of the professors, a really kind priest named Tony Gittins, suggested I should consider studying at the seminary. And he got me a scholarship to take one class, and then a couple of others. And that childhood desire to become a priest was back. But this was the late 1980s, and the possibility that it might happen, that women would be ordained, seemed farther away. But I figured if it didn't happen, the education would still be good, and I'd use my degree no matter what type of ministry I worked in. And soon I was a candidate for the Master's of Divinity degree at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. And thanks to generous scholarships from other sources, including the Sisters of St. Agnes and Mary's Pence, coupled with a work-study grant, I successfully completed the program and received my MDiv 5 years after beginning it. Now, that seminary experience was bizarre for a couple of reasons. One was that the work-study grant left me working as a janitor in the school. One of my responsibilities was to clean the living quarters of some of my classmates and professors. So in order for me to have the privilege of sitting in class with the guys, among other things, I had to clean their bathrooms. And that old feeling of resentment from my grade school days was back. Being female left me doing the dirty work, and had I been male, I would have had my whole tuition paid for. I don't know if you saw it earlier this year, Nicole Sotelo wrote about this issue in an article in NCR. The other reason that seminary experience was bizarre for me is that I was painfully facing the sexual violence that I had endured as a teen. And I was seeking healing and justice from church officials in Ohio. I was dealing with their betrayal, with their empty promises, even blatant lies from provincials and bishops. And in many ways, that experience of betrayal was more shattering for me than the actual sexual violence. If we couldn't believe the church officials about this, what else were they lying about? There was such a disconnect for me and a denial. So while I'm experiencing, on the one hand, these events in Ohio that are leaving myself and my family members devastated, I'm going to these theology classes and working with the homeless in Chicago. So I'm working for justice and peace. I'm fighting anti-apartheid efforts. I'm working with African American women. I'm living with them and their children. They who had had their rights trampled so horribly that they ended up homeless. I was demonstrating against the war machine and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I played my guitar and I planned amazing liturgies in my parish and at the Catholic Worker House. And I attended women-led liturgies at the home of Patsy Crowley. And all the while, church officials were preaching equality, justice, and love. I joined Donna Quinn on the steps of the cathedral in Chicago while the men were being ordained. I was arrested at demonstrations when Congress approved funding for the MX missile, and I was arrested out in the desert where nuclear bombs were tested to celebrate Dorothy Day's 90th anniversary. And all the while, that deep hurt from my childhood sexual violence just grew inside of me. I told people, and most were compassionate, but it didn't take away my pain. Most people who I told didn't have a clue what to say or what to do to help me. It is so much easier to join with a group who are discriminated against. Being in a group means so much, but for those of us wounded by sexual violence, it's also personal, and it's extremely lonely. It didn't take me long to realize that church officials were going to help me, and I still needed healing. And it was the 1980s. Self-help was big. Some of you remember the 1980s. That's when Mothers Against Drunk Driving started. Anyway, I began looking for other survivors and started SNAP, and we were using the self-help model, and we figured out that what we would do is just try to figure out things for ourselves and find healing. At one of the early SNAP meetings, which were so painful and emotional, one of the women started laughing. And these sessions had both men and women. And when she was laughing, she said, "Don't you get it?" She said, "We can't all be first." And I didn't understand. And she pointed out that her bishop had told her what my bishop had told me, that I was the first one to come forward. And then we started asking each other what else our bishops said. So by the early 1990s, we knew that the bishops had a policy, they had a mantra, and that they were all telling us as victims the same thing. And these facts were finally exposed publicly in a grand jury report that came out from here in Philadelphia that exposed that church officials were telling victims that they were the only ones, that church officials denied that they knew anyone else had come forward, that they had an effort to try to make us question whether this really even happened to us. They questioned our veracity, if we didn't misinterpret affections, that type of thing. They also persuaded us to stay away from the police and that it would harm ourselves, our families, our church, and gosh knows we didn't want to harm our church. So we didn't tell, for the most part. We didn't go to police, and as a result, our perpetrators were just transferred to other places where they could and did sexually violate more children and more adults. I want to point out that today, things haven't really changed much. The rhetoric is different, but children and vulnerable adults still remain at risk. How much time do we have?
1 more minute, 2 more minutes.
Okay, so in this last 2 minutes, let me just say a couple of things quickly. Boys are not the only ones sexually violated by priests. About half of the victims who contact SNAP are female. It isn't just the priests who abuse, so do bishops and seminarians and brothers and, yes, nuns. And it isn't just children who are sexually violated. There's a largely hidden scandal of clerics who commit heinous sexual misconduct by exploiting, manipulating, and abusing women who are adults but who are vulnerable. And the sexual abuse and cover-up scandal is not history. It's ongoing, it's today. And it isn't only the institutional church failing to deal with it. Yes, the bishops and the Vatican officials are not dealing with it. Neither are the heads of religious communities of men. But neither are the religious communities of women. The LCWR has rebuffed SNAP for over a decade. Victims abused by nuns, for the most part, are not treated any better than those of us raped by the priests and the male religious. So what is it that we want? We believe that all the records should be turned over to police and prosecutors. We think that those records in the Vatican should be turned over to Interpol. And we believe that the bishops in every local jurisdiction should be ordered to do the same. We think that the predator priest names should be on church websites. We think that church officials, you could join them, should be encouraging the reform of secular child safety laws. We think that the bishops and the heads of religious communities should be defrocked or at least demoted if they have continued to hide child sex crimes and transfer predators. Lastly, we believe that it's important to reward and honor the whistleblowers. Some of them are here in this room. Many of you have spoken out. And it is so appreciated, and I know my time is up, and let me just say that nothing in me today would want to be ordained in the church.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Our next speaker, some of you may have already heard at the academic seminar yesterday. Dr. Shannon Dd Williams is an assistant professor of United States and African American history at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and currently at work on her first book, Subversive Habits, Black Nuns and the Long Struggle to Desegregate Catholic America, which chronicles the epic journey of Black Catholic sisters in the United States from their fiercely contested beginnings in the slave societies of the 19th century South to the present day. In December of 2014, Dr. Williams, in a guest blog on Pathos, publicly criticized the U.S. Catholic theologian's statement on racial injustice that initially excluded Black women and girls as victims and opponents of state and vigilante violence.
So thank you so much. Yesterday, I dedicated my talk to my mother, who was the first Black woman to graduate from the University of Notre Dame. As I've stated, in addition to sort of skewering archives, looking for sources, reconstructing to reconstruct the history of Black female religious life in the United States, I've also been fortunate enough to collect the testimonies of over 100 current and former Black sisters who have shared their stories with me, and I'm just going to share a few with you today. One sister that I had been looking for quite some time, I was able to track down last year, and I told this story yesterday. I knew when I called her I had about 2 minutes to sort of explain who I was and hope that she would share her story with me. And she took some time, and then she finally said, "Why now? Why now?" And she said, "Shannon, I'm ready to speak. This is the first time that I can actually talk about what happened to me in religious life without being angry, without tears." And then we set a date, and then we spoke for over 3 hours for our interview, and then we have sort of remained in contact. When asked in 2014 what she thought the greatest accomplishment of her 13-year tenure as a Catholic sister was, 68-year-old Cheryl Adams did not hesitate in her response. "Survival," she proclaimed. "I lived through it. I survived it." In 1963, Adams, then just 18 years old, entered the Washington, D.C. community of the School Sisters of Notre Dame as the community's first African-American candidate. Not the first to apply, but the first to be accepted. Like scores of young African-American women and girls who desegregated the nation's historically white Catholic sisterhoods during the Civil Rights Movement, Adams had been optimistic that the racial prejudice which had formally barred the admission of US-born Black women and girls into white congregations in the previous decades would quickly dissipate as integration increasingly became the law of the land, and the rule of the church. After all, if the universal Catholic Church could not atone for its sins of racism and segregation, what institution could? However, Adams's hopes for acceptance and equal treatment in her congregation were quickly dashed. Like many pioneering Black sisters in white congregations, Adams, known in religion as Sister Nathan Marie, endured racial harassment, verbal abuse, and emotional isolation on a daily basis inside the cloister. Although Adams, a former Notre Dame pupil and a product of DC's segregated and integrated parochial schools, had expected to encounter some resistance to her presence in her congregation, the 24/7 micro and macroaggressions of her hostile white counterparts knew no bounds. On the day of her first profession ceremony in 1965, for example, 5 of the newly invested novice sisters with whom Adams entered the order loudly yelled "nigger" in unison and snickered as she walked down the path of the back of the mother house to join her family, who had come to celebrate the sacred occasion. Adams also routinely endured the humiliation of waiting extended periods of time to be assigned to one of her order schools to teach, because most of her white counterparts, many of whom taught African American children, steadfastly refused to live and dine with her on a non-segregated basis. Although Adams' admission to the chapter had been subject to a general chapter vote in Rome in 1962, she had never expected such humiliating votes would continue once she professed her holy vow as a sister. However, white school sisters of Notre Dame across the nation routinely took votes on whether or not to accept Adams into their convents, teach with her, or simply host her for a meal. Despite such hostilities, Adams resolved to remain in community and fight the racism deeply embedded in the Catholic Church. After King's assassination in 1968, Adams, who was distressed by her community's staunch indifference to the tragedy. In fact, there were several who openly celebrated his assassination and others who simply just turned the radio off, and then when the rebellion started, applauded when the police shot to kill people who rebelled in the street. She decided to become active in the Black Power movement and serve on the executive boards of the National Black Sisters Conference and the National Office for Black Catholics in the late 60s and 70s. However, in 1976, Adams, then just 30 years old, suffered a heart attack, which her physician attributed solely to stress. When no member of her community visited her during her 2-week stay in the intensive care unit at a local hospital, Adams finally conceded that it was time to depart religious life and end her chapter's reluctant experiment in racial integration. "It broke my heart," she stoically recalled. "They shredded my heart." Sadly, when Adams returned to the mother house in 1993 with a former band member to commemorate the 30th anniversary of their entrance into the community, very little had changed in the minds and hearts of the white women who had driven her from religious life nearly 2 decades earlier. In fact, when a former superior who had routinely harassed Adams and delayed the profession of her final vows for several years approached her, the elderly white nun unapologetically stated, "You know, Nathan, we just weren't ready for you when you entered the community." In response, Adams simply said, "Well, you know, Martin Marie, I was only 18 years old, and I guess I just wasn't ready for you." To date, the fiercely contested entry of Black women and girls into the nation's historically white sisterhoods remains among the most under-researched and least reported on topics in American religious history. Such an omission is glaring considering the massive bodies of scholarship that exist on the Catholic Church and the African American struggle for freedom and justice, respectively. It's also quite surprising considering the substantial amount of scholarly and popular attention given specifically to the desegregation of historically white institutions and spaces in the United States. Indeed, thousands of books, films, public history venues, songs, poems, and paintings have meticulously documented the individual and collective struggles waged to integrate the nation's historically white institutions, even the Catholic priesthood, though there is still much work to be done on that as well. Yet the long and largely unsuccessful African American struggle to integrate U.S. Catholic female religious life remains conspicuously hidden. Moreover, the lives and labors of Black women and girls who desegregated these communities remain largely unknown and unexplored. Missing, too, is a thoughtful analysis of the politics of white supremacy in female religious life and its effect on the nature and quality of life inside the convent. As a result, the inability and in many cases, unwillingness of white congregations to confront and deal seriously with racism within their own ranks has been rendered largely invisible in the annals of history. What I am attempting to do with my own book, and specifically with the testimonies of Black women who came forward with the formation of the National Black Sisters Conference, and those who have continued to share their stories with me up until the present day, is to begin to remedy this myopia and also fill an important gap in the history of female religious life, not only in the United States, but indeed around the world. Despite the recent proliferation of scholarship on Catholic sisters, race remains widely underutilized as a significant category of analysis. As a result, the abysmal and historical lack of racial diversity in U.S. female religious life has been widely misunderstood and misrepresented. In particular, the marginal population of Black sisters in the United States has frequently been attributed to a historical lack of vocations from the African American Catholic community. However, historians have failed to analyze the full impact of racially exclusionary admissions policies on the character and makeup of predominantly and all-white Catholic sisterhoods. In fact, most studies fail to document that such policies even existed. The few that do mention them briefly and grossly dismiss their impact on and the ideology of white supremacy on the national sister population and the quality of life in convents. What we know is that prior to World War II, these policies formally barred African American women and girls from entering white congregations in the United States. As a result, only Black women who were extremely light-skinned who could pass as white had the opportunity to go into the vast majority of the white congregations. We also know that U.S.-born Black women and girls seeking to enter religious life were routinely, but not always, tracked into the nation's historically Black congregations. An undetermined number of African American female vocations were lost to the church due to these restrictive policies. We can't know the numbers, but I've encountered far too many elderly Black Catholic women, many of whom are associate sisters or members of congregations who were explicitly denied the right to go into the communities of the educators, of the women who had educated them. We also know that in some cases, white vocation directors simply did not know or care that Black orders existed and thus offered no alternatives to young Black female candidates seeking to enter their congregations. And so what we also know then is until 1922, any Black woman who was called to religious life but wanted to pursue a contemplative vocation could not go into any community until a historically Black community was founded for them. And so there are other cases, again, of those who could pass as white going in, but again, they were forced, they either hid their racial heritage going into those communities or discovered and had to sort of agree to sort of keep that part of themselves isolated. Again, while it's impossible to determine how many hearts were broken and how many Black female vocations were lost to the church, it is painfully clear that white Catholic sisterhoods were among the fiercest strongholds of racial segregation and white supremacy in the 20th century. Most white orders staunchly opposed the integration of their ranks through America's civil rights years, and most never had a perpetually professed African American sister in the 20th century. Moreover, the oral history testimonies of Black sisters reveal that when they entered white communities, most routinely endured years of bullying, neglect, and other forms of racist abuse from their white counterparts. In particular, many pioneering Black sisters in white orders felt pressured to deny and degrade their racial heritage in order to feel accepted into their communities. As African American sister of the Blessed Sacrament, Christine Neesmith aptly put it in 1971, entering a white order meant ceasing to be Black and looking upon what you grew up with as uncouth. You could do the Irish jig, but anything African was taboo. Such abuse and the prolonged intractability of white supremacy in religious life eventually drove scores of Black sisters out of their communities in the late 1960s and 70s, decimating their already marginal population. While some sisters left on their own accord or in explicit protest to racial discriminations, many others, in temporary vows, were summarily dismissed from their communities as a result of their political activism and willingness to testify publicly about their experiences of abuse in religious life. For example, the first pioneering sisters in the Sisters of St. Mary, which are now the Franciscan Sisters of Mary in St. Louis, when they first went into the community, they were forced to go into the back doors of the mother house. They could not use the same facilities as their white counterparts. They could not eat with them, et cetera. They were also forced to profess their vows separately. Other instances, we know that many Black sisters were forced to wait extended periods of time, several years in fact, waiting for the election of a progressive superior to allow for their admission into the community. Such was the case of Sister Joyce Williams, who had to wait 4 years before she was able to enter into the the Order of St. Benedict in Minnesota, but she remained until her death in 2006. We remember those, particularly of Thea Bowman and others who went in as young teenagers at 15, who were routinely called the N-word, told that they would only go to the in-heaven, et cetera. Those who were called pickaninnies, and oftentimes were forced to call upon their ancestors, the faith of their ancestors, specifically to sort of help them to sustain themselves in their communities. And again, sort of with those who were not able to find community, not until the end, and the formation of the National Black Sisters Conference. This is Patty Gray. those who were forced to pass for white, and then those who finally sort of took off their habits when their students who were isolated, their only black students were isolated and decided to reveal themselves. I'll just go a little bit further, those who decided to pray to become white in order to mitigate, or what they thought would help mitigate the opposition that they were facing. Because in addition to everything else, I also want us to remember those who did not survive. There's a disproportionate number of black women who decided to remain in religious life who died very young, in their late 40s, in their 50s. Among them are Sister Thea Bowman, Sister Dolores Harrell, and Sister Reginalda Polk, but there are many more. And I just wanted us to sort of consider what that also means, and also the cost of what that meant. And many of their peers have made the argument that indeed they died very young from cancer and other sort of ailments because of the level of hostility that they faced in their communities. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Next, we're going to turn to a different part of the world. We're going to hear from Virginia Saldana. She is a founding member and current secretary of both the Indian Women Theologians Forum and the Indian Christian Women's Movement. She has held many positions, far too many for me to detail here, in her parish and in the Archdiocese of Mumbai, and has worked tirelessly to empower women in India. She's the author of Woman, Image of God, and 2 volumes of Discipleship of Women in Asia. Virginia.
I'm just going to give you my experience of how I came to taking up the issue of sex abuse of women in the church in India. I had heard about the sex abuse of sisters when I was in charge of the Commission of Women in the Catholic Bishops' Conference of India. In the course of going around India, giving seminars, etc., many sisters would come up to me and whisper about experience and asked me if I could do anything about it. I used to ask several superiors, provincials, and I even asked one Mother General whom I met in Switzerland, how do you deal with this? And they said, we deal with it in-house. And I couldn't get beyond that. Then, when I ended my term in the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences in December 2009, I was praying for inspiration to enter a new phase of working for women. In March 2010, an Asian sister contacted me through the internet to tell me of her experience of being molested by an Indian priest in the UK. Later, in May 2010, I was in Taiwan for the last meeting on women I was organizing for the FABC. Over tea, I got talking to the Charge d'Affaires of the Vatican to Taiwan, and he said to me, "What have you done about the sex abuse of women in Asia?" And I was taken aback. I answered jokingly, "In Asia, we have sex, but we do not talk about it." He then said, "I am serious, especially about the sex abuse of women in India." That raised my eyebrows, and I thought, is this where God is pushing me to go? I then asked the American sister, Mary Noel's sister, who was the MC at our meeting there that day, to just informally broach this topic during the day, because the theme of the meeting was violence against women. And that very afternoon during the discussions, there was a sister from Taiwan who broke down and spoke about her experience of abuse by a priest in Taiwan. The issue then became part of our statement that went out from that meeting. That very night, I was checking my emails and found an email from someone in my parish asking me to urgently meet a young woman who wanted to talk to me desperately. I made it a point to meet with her the day I landed back in Mumbai. She had a chilling story to tell about abuse by a priest to whom she had turned to for healing of a deep emotional hurt. He started to have sex with her and claimed he was showing her God's love. She apparently got hooked onto the priest. She believed that he had become her special love. She attended several retreats he gave to young people, and she discovered that he was having sex with other women as well. That's when she felt so broken that she and another young woman who was mesmerized and raped by this priest during a retreat came to me with their stories. With the help of the women's group that I belong to in Mumbai, we took up the issue with our local cardinal and pushed for an investigation. Though the priest was found guilty, it took several months before he was removed from the parish he was working in and from ministry. We had to use a lawyer to send the cardinal legal notices, because in India there is a law against sexual harassment in the workplace, and we said that the church is the workplace of the priests. When he ultimately left the parish he was posted in, the parish was not informed why he was moved away. As a result, his following of young people continues. They strongly defend his innocence in the abuse issue and use all the traditional arguments against the women who have accused the priest of abuse. It took a lot of persistence on the part of the Asian sister I had mentioned earlier to get the bishops she was dealing with, in consultation with me, to even consent to an investigation that was properly constituted to ensure justice. There too, the investigation finally took place after about a long year of communication back and forth. The priest was found guilty, but after a couple of years, he was returned to ministry. Because this Asian sister is placed in another country, and the local survivors that she managed to unearth, who were also abused by this priest, were silenced. Except for the sister, who still continues to follow up the issue with the bishop, the other survivors of abuse have fallen silent. One has even shifted to another city. Being the primary person who unearthed 2 cases of abuse in India, 2 cases, priests, 2 cases of priests, I feel I have been treated as an offender rather than the actual priest offenders. It has been very painful. I am treated as a persona non grata and marginalized in my parish, as well as by the official church. Personally, I feel overwhelmed by the clerical and hierarchical power in the church. During the whole process of taking up the issue of abuse in the church, as the most recent case of abuse taken up in India by a wide spectrum of people indicates, the earlier was a sister from another country, lay persons, but though the sisters in India are the vast majority of women who are abused by priests, not a single sister, not a single congregation had raised the issue with the bishops or challenged the bishops to stop this. And despite the fact that we have a wonderful gender policy, okay? And these men had the guts to bring out a gender policy and remain silent on this issue of abuse. And the sisters remain muzzled up to this day. Now, a sister last year, she complained about a seminarian who was taking a video of her having a shower through one of the slats that opened into the bathing room where she was. She caught him red-handed, she ran across, bolted the door of his room, called the rector of that place and said, I want you to open the door and question this man about what he was doing and retrieve his phone. You know what the rector told her? I'm not going to do it. He's my son. I have to protect him. She got so upset, she slapped him. Do you know she was made to apologize? She was made to apologize by her provincial. She was made to apologize to that provincial. Now, she experienced a violation of her privacy when taking a shower. She complained at all levels, but did not get any response. On the contrary, she was further humiliated and made to feel that she was at fault. The seminarian was sent to Rome for further studies, and after all the humiliation, her family forced her to leave the congregation. All kinds of follow-up with the CBCI. Now, we as a group took it up. With the CBCI, the nuncio, the Commission of Abuse in Rome have not yielded any results. The Commission of Abuse in Rome said they only deal with children, not with women abuse. Though the issue of sex abuse was discussed by the Catholic Religious of India, the joint umbrella of group of men and women religious in India, in February 2006, at the general body meeting where the then president, who was the South Asian provincial of Jesuits, said, the tendency is to silence the victims whenever complaints of sexual abuse are made. From now on, we will work to formulate a policy that will ensure justice for all within the church. A wonderful statement. But to this day, the body has not moved in the matter. Not at all. Though the abuse of religious women in India is so pervasive, and sisters who have been impregnated by priests are made to leave the congregations, while the priest continues in their ministry as if nothing has happened. Not a single congregation has had the courage to indict a priest for this crime. Strivani, an NGO run by the Holy Spirit Sisters for the Empowerment of Women, had 3 consecutive consultations following the publication of my article that broke open this issue in India and Asia in June 2010. When I heard about the experience of those young women who were abused during the retreat, I was so, consumed with anger that I had to speak about it. So I wrote this article on a web page which is featuring on bishopaccountability.org. Internet news group that published my article first was forced to take it down because of the attacks from this priest's disciples, who are a lot of IT experts, you see. They kept attacking the site. Finally, they took my article down. So following the 3 consultations under the heading Gender Relations in the Church, a group of us, together with a lawyer and a bishop, drafted norms or guidelines to deal with cases of sexual abuse in the church in India. This was presented to the Catholic Bishops' Conference of India in 2013, but to this day, the bishops have not adopted these norms for enforcement. Several follow-up calls to our local cardinal, who is the president of the Bishops' Conference, and the bishop who worked with us to reveal that they are still looking into the matter. It is clear that gender justice is not a priority in the church, notwithstanding the grandiose statements and documents, including the much publicized gender policy released by the bishops that claim they are serious about gender justice. I leave you with a quote from a professor from a theological school in Bangalore, India, in his article in this book, which was publicized following our consultation. It has been edited. One of the editors is Astrid, Gender Relations in the Church. So his article has been published over here. His article is titled, Sex Abuse Scandal and the Church, a Critical Appraisal. He says, I quote, "The pattern and development of the abuse scandal puts into question the very structure of the church, the concept of priesthood, the existing system of gender relationships, the administration of justice within the church, the lack of dialogue and participatory leadership in the church, Even the sincere attempts to tackle the issue without radical changes in the very structure of the church will be ineffective. Thank you.
And now we're going to hear from Mary Steed. Mary Steed's Irish birth mother was sent to live and work in one of the Magdalen laundries where she was forced to give Mary up. Mary was adopted by a suburban Philadelphia couple, and when she became an adult, she launched a search to find her birth mother and currently serves in a volunteer capacity as the U.S. Coordinator of Adoption Rights Alliance and the committee director and co-founder of the Justice for Magdalene's Research and the Philomena Project. Mari.
Thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be here. It's been really interesting hearing different people's stories. I'm sort of the culmination of nearly a century of probably the worst of patriarchal religious repression you can imagine in Ireland. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the history of the Catholic Church in Ireland and sort of its heyday at the start of the 20th century, particularly once Ireland gained its freedom from the United Kingdom, Eamon de Valera, and sort of his notion of what he wanted Ireland to be, which was this model of national purity. So anyone who didn't fit that model or that standard, any of us who were born outside of wedlock, whose parents may have been poor and struggling, may have separated. Of course, divorce didn't become legal in Ireland until 1995, but there were families that were broken as a result of violence or abuse. So any of the children, any of the women particularly, that came out of that sort of marginalized, othered environment became victims of some of the harshest treatment you could possibly imagine at the hands of people who were supposed to be giving them mercy and kindness. Ireland's Constitution was written in 1922, and specific in it is the language to cherish the children of the nation. And they have failed to do it for nearly 100 years, and that includes women most especially. My background, my mother actually was born out of wedlock herself. She was one of 4 children that my grandmother from County Wexford had the audacity to have outside of marriage. And for reasons unknown to any of us, we don't know how she didn't end up stoned or in a Magdalen laundry, but we suspect that part of it was because her first two children were males, and the family ran a quarry business. So they were useful to the family, and therefore they were raised within the family by maternal uncles and an aunt, I believe. A third child, another daughter, actually died young from meningitis, so she was sort of out of the picture at a very young age. And my mother was the last, and the decision was made at that point, A, for my grandmother to make her way to Manchester, where she had a sister living there, and become a proper married woman and put this all behind her, and to get rid of my mother. So my mother was actually sent through what we call the first linchpin in the architecture of containment in Ireland. That was the industrial school. So she spent the first 14 years of her life under the care of the Good Shepherd sisters at a place called St. Dominic's. It was an industrial school in Waterford for girls. And of course, we now know from facts and testimony and so forth that even there, many of these school-age girls were put to work in the laundry that also operated on the premises there, as well as older women. From there, it apparently, I guess my understanding of the story is that my grandmother tried to get my mother out of there and reclaim her, and there was some big row with the nuns. So what they did was to circumvent that, they sent my mother further south to Cork to what was known as the Sunday's Well Magdalen Laundry, and that was also run by the Good Shepherd sisters. She spent the next 10 years of her life, so roughly from age 15 to age 26, doing sewing in this laundry. They ran a commercial sewing operation, commercial laundry facility. Now bear in mind, these Magdalen laundries were privately run by the religious there. At the time, there was no spoken tie to the government of Ireland. They weren't in the same sense as the industrial schools. Those received capitation grants from the Department of Education in Ireland, and there was oversight and inspection by the Department of Education, not that it helped all that much, because abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse was rampant in the industrial schools. But the Magdalen laundries at that time were recognized as being private institutions that women and girls were sent to, And so any of the money that was earned commercially through those operations, I know there's a popular conception, well, the nuns must have kept all that. No, they didn't. It all rolled uphill to the diocese. In fact, the cathedral in Galway was all but built on the backs of Magdalene women at the Galway Laundry. That money was a fairly good sum at the time. They had contracts with the Department of Defense, with the local hotels, the local townspeople. So they were making, you know, quite a bit of money on it. In fact, so much so that the Irish labor unions protested and made a lot of noise about it, saying, we're losing, we can't get these contracts because we can't compete with the nuns. They keep undercutting us, you know, with this business. So these were very definitely commercial enterprises. The women were never paid for their work. They never earned a pension for any of the work that they did there. Contrary to popular belief, they were not free to come and go. There were bars on the windows. If they tried to do a runner, they would have been immediately taken by the guards, by the police in Ireland, and dragged back, or by local Catholic rescue groups. They would have found them on the streets and dragged them right back. So that was 10 years of my mother's life she spent sewing for the Good Shepherd Sisters at the Magdalene Laundry at Sunday's Well. She was let out, and I've recently learned, and this adds further to the tragedy, not because she earned it, but because she had been raped by a priest and became pregnant while at Sunday's Well. The child that she had was stillborn, but the nuns decided that rather than keep her there where she might be further temptation, they moved her to Dublin. They got her a job referral to work for a Catholic hospital, Our Lady's, in Crumlin, Dublin, and she worked there for about 2 years as a ward aide, met my father, became pregnant with me. Now bear in mind, this is a 26-year-old woman who, aside from priests or workmen in the laundries or the industrial schools, wouldn't have known what a man was if she tripped over one. So her sexual ignorance at that age would have been probably on par with a 12-year-old. Plus, they were starved for affection. So, you know, do I blame her for falling for the first handsome man that came across her path? Certainly not. Be that as it may, she was then sent down back to Cork to a mother and baby home that was run by the Sacred Heart nuns. Now, for any of you who have seen the movie Philomena, you will be familiar with those operations. The Sacred Hearts ran 3 mother and baby homes in Ireland, one in Besborough, Cork, which is where I was born, one in Castlepollard in County Wexmeath, and then, of course, Shanross Abbey in Tipperary, which is where Philomena and her son Anthony were. The policy at these mother-baby homes is if you could not afford to pay your own room and board, you had to work it off, and you had to stay there until you could work it off. So for the vast majority of us, our mothers were there with us from anywhere from birth to age 5. We have some children that were adopted 4 and 5 years old, and their mothers didn't leave the mother-baby homes until the child was sent out for adoption. When I was born in 1960, it was sort of on the waning end of the American adoptions. The vast majority of them occurred, I'll say, from the early 1950s when Ireland first adopted an adoption act. They didn't even have legal adoption until 1952. So the vast majority occurred right after that law was passed, and Americans, of course, were crazy to get their hands on Irish children. There were waiting lists here in the United States through Catholic Charities, so this was the perfect alternate route for many prospective adoptive parents to take and find children in Ireland. And I hate to say this, but it's true. I know it's true because my own parents have told me this. But there was also a fear in the United States that even if you adopted through a Catholic agency, you might get a child that could be biracial, God forbid. So there was this notion that Ireland was the perfect happy hunting ground because the children could be guaranteed white. Now my parents, you know, that was not a consideration for them, and I'm not here to say that that's, you know, anything that motivated them, but they had heard that through the grapevine that a lot of couples were worried about that. So that's a bit of a tragedy on that side. The Irish to American adoptions were sort of interesting because this, again, it's part of this whole architecture of containment in Ireland. By keeping our mothers in these mother-baby homes and setting up this trade with the United States, it was all done under the table, but with the firm blessing of Archbishop John Charles McQuaid in Dublin. The book that I'm sitting here holding, this is the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, or previously known as External Affairs. It's all their memoranda and documents from 1948 to 1951. So this is while they were in the midst of discussing a potential adoption act, and not only that, but getting requests by the thousands from Americans, from people in the UK. Can we adopt all these Irish children that you have in these homes? So when you read the back and forth between the ministers, the consulates in the United States, Catholic Charities in Washington, D.C., their central office, it's really interesting to see the influence of John Charles McQuaid on government policy, essentially. And just to read you one specific, this is from a memorandum in 1951, this was just prior to the passage of the Adoption Act, from one of the secretaries, undersecretaries in the Department of Foreign Affairs to the consulate in New York. And he is saying, "We have just found out unofficially and indirectly the conditions on which His Grace, the Archbishop of Dublin, will allow Irish children to be sent to America for adoption. A statement setting out these conditions is attached." Now, this infamous statement included a requirement for prospective adopting parents in the United States that the wife, and my mother had to go through this, my adoptive mother, had to prove that they had not shirked the natural responsibilities of marriage. So she had to prove she wasn't a virgin before she could adopt from Ireland. That was known as the infamous McQuaid Dictate. And she said it was the most embarrassing, humiliating thing she had ever been through. I guess, you know, I'm sitting here comfortable. I grew up in Philadelphia. I grew up in the heyday of Catholic education in this area. It was excellent. There is not a thing that I could ever sit here and say that I didn't benefit from in Catholic education in the United States. We had very progressive nuns. I had Sisters of St. Joseph. I had Mercy nuns in high school, Sisters of the Immaculate Conception, all excellent teachers. So it's kind of ironic in a way that the Irish government and the church in Ireland sort of placed us in this perfect petri dish to make us activists and make us really smart. You know? I don't think they saw that one coming. Be that as it may, I had a great adoptive upbringing. My parents were terrific people. You know, I had all the benefits of a wonderful life here in the United States. And the tragic part of that is that was what my own natural mother begged for, because she knew what her background had been. And her biggest fear, she knew she couldn't keep me. That was out of the question. Women in Ireland had no options. They didn't even have single mother support or any kind of state aid for women until the 1970s. You couldn't rent a flat if you were a single mother. You couldn't get a job if you were a single mother, especially not a government job, civil service job. There were no protections, no nothing. So for a woman of my mother's generation, for Philomena Lee, for thousands like them, their only option was to have their child adopted out. That was it. No abortion, no other options. That was it. So in her mind, she was even afraid to leave me open to the possibility of Irish adoption because that was such a rare thing. Most Irish families couldn't afford to adopt children. Maybe you were fostered, maybe you were boarded out. But that's sort of what led me to my activism, was just sort of to, A, get answers for myself, get answers for my mother, find out what happened to her, why didn't she have these options. It's not about retribution, it's not about vengeance, it's about asking the questions and making sure that it doesn't happen again. And that's sort of what fed into my activism for Justice for Magdalens as well as Adoption Rights Alliance.
My question is for Dr. Williams. There was a novel called The Secret Life of Bees, where the women worshipped a Black Madonna. In your work, have you discovered, is there really a Black Madonna, or was that a product of fiction?
Well, not that I've encountered sort of the image. I know a lot of in Polish Catholic communities, there is this, the image of the Black Madonna. But even more so than that, we sort of remember sort of the history of Sisters of Black African descent predates the development of female religious life in the church, in Europe by 2 centuries. Indeed, sort of the first woman that we believe, or she's at least canonized in the church, Saint Iphigenia, was believed to have founded the first monastery for women in the 1st century. She was converted to Catholicism by St. Matthew. And so in Latin America, many of the sodalities and other sort of religious communities and religious organizations are named after sort of these early black saints of the church, sort of not only St. Iphigenia, but think about St. Moses the Black and others, and sort of in African American churches, not only sort of with St. Martin de Porres, but sort of in Eastern Africa, St. Augustine, St. Monica, et cetera. There is a very clear sort of tradition of sort of racial pride. It has to be negotiated against the church. I think we also have to sort of remember, right, like the Catholic Church played a foundational role in the development of the transatlantic slave trade. The church was one of the largest corporate leaders, owners of slaves in Latin America, but also in the United States. Religious orders of men and women owned slaves. One of the sisters that I mentioned on yesterday, I mean, many of these sisters are actually descendants of Catholic slaves. Sister Cora Marie Billings, who's the first religious sister of mercy in Philadelphia, her great-grandfather was one of the slaves owned by the Jesuits at Georgetown, and his name is listed on their plaque. And so this is a very, the church's history of sort of colonization, segregation, rape, right, is well documented, and yet we don't. Somehow we sort of have forgotten, or at least we attempt to sort of to push this aside.
We don't acknowledge.
Say it again?
Almost like they don't acknowledge.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Let alone apologize. There are certain cases, but not the vast majority.
Thank you. Laura?
My question is for Barbara. I have 3 children in the Catholic school system in Chicago, and it seems like one of the responses to the sexual abuse crisis is to have volunteers go through the Virtus training program. And it seems, to my personal experience, is that program isn't always implemented consistently throughout the Catholic schools and parishes. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts were about that program, and if there's any steps or recommendations that you have for parents to how to promote better policies or procedures in the parishes and schools.
So I think it's really important to recognize that the Veritas program was developed by the risk management people in the church. So what does that tell you? That program is not created in a way to protect the children. The program is created to protect the church officials and their reputation. So if you look on our website, snapnetwork.org, actually one of our leaders published a new book just this week about how to raise, I forget the exact title, but it's like raising children to be armed to prevent sexual violence. And so I would encourage you to check out that and check our website. But, and there's many programs that we should have in place, but we should start with demanding openness and transparency. Your Archbishop Supich continues to keep records hidden and concealed. Parents should know the history of their pastors. They don't.
I'm Rosalind Costa from Bangladesh. I was a nun and was forced out when I protested priests' sexual violence. And I was forced out. This is one of the things. Then secondly, SNAP has handled one case in the USA, and one priest went to Bangladesh, and he abused many children, not Christians, Muslims, children. And when I spoke out, I am still running a legal case against me since 2011. And SNAP published this report in USA, and because of that, I was accused for publishing this report in the USA on his behalf, against him, so I have been punished. What Virginia Saldana has said, similar situation is in Bangladesh. The problem is the church is always trying to save the priests and exclude the victims as well as the sisters. Thank you.
I am Maria Mejia. I come from Mexico. I just want to share with all of you, we are so struck with the stories you are telling, each one of you, and it will be very important to be able to gather these and publicize them and disseminate these stories, because each one of them and each one of those who have been spoken here are so valuable and so touching that they can be paradigmatic cases to move mobilization against these issues. And I want to congratulate Barbara. Finally, I met you. the work of SNAP and the Constitutional Center for Constitutional Rights during the last convention. The Committee of Experts of the Convention on the Rights of the Child is so valuable. They finally, the Committee of Experts finally hold the Vatican accountable for all these issues. I don't really know if they have really do anything really, but the recommendations that this convention did, that the Committee of Experts of the Convention of the Rights of the Child did to the Holy See, are very important. We have a summary. I'm sorry, but we don't have enough, but you can go to the webpage. SNAP, of course, has the webpage with these recommendations. I think that's a very good strategy. There are some tools out there that we have to really use to hold accountable these people for the crimes they have covered. Thank you.
I don't have a question, rather it's a comment for Mari. Mari, back in 1952, I believe it was 52, I was a very young sister in Fresno, California. And I recall that our pastor was, seemed to be able to find infants for adoption in the parish. At that time, I recalled one particular family that had adopted a baby girl. I think she was about 3 months old when they got her. And I was thinking how wonderful this is. And maybe someday I could do that myself. But of course, not having any idea of the background of where these children were coming from.
Yeah. Actually, it's funny you bring up Fresno. I personally know family from, well, 2 families in Fresno. So that was a real hotbed for some reason. I don't know why. But 4 of them adopted in one family. They were all born the same year, in 58, and they came over in 52. And I thought, now how do they explain that going into, grammar school, 4 of them all in the same class, but they're not blood related, but they're all adopted siblings. But they, they did well, and now they've all reunited with their families, so.
I'm a co-pastor of a small community in suburban Cleveland, Ohio. And we know that our parishioners are out there in the world. And I would imagine that some of them have stories similar to the ones you related today and have given up on organized religion. We would love to have them in our communities, but have no idea how to reach out to marginalized people who have been hurt. And if you have any insights as to how we can find the people who we believe would probably find a source of community with us, but how can we find them? How can we invite them? How can we make them welcome?
The only thing I can suggest is if the goal would be to help survivors heal, it would be welcomed. If the goal is to get more parishioners or more people to come to your church, I don't see them coming. And so it depends on how it's approached, but I can tell you that in the survivor community, we do not necessarily feel support from a lot of other people. And when we're organizing an event, and we organize events sometimes in Cleveland, Ohio, and there's 2 or 3 of us standing on the sidewalk to try to get a message out. The vast majority of victims of sexual violence want to remain anonymous, and we believe have every right to remain anonymous. But if you would be willing to be a voice for some of them, please join and help us. Get involved, and you'll see where there are places. If you befriend survivors, you will learn, you'll see how to help and how you can make a difference.
I know just from some of the survivors I've met and spoken with, part of the difficulty with reconciliation and healing is for those people, they feel like they're going right back to their even if you weren't the one that personally perpetrated the abuse, that's how they view it. The church is the abuser to them. So it's very difficult to get them to come to the table and acknowledge that, this sweet person sitting here who's trying to help you is not the person that harmed you. But that's a difficult barrier to cross, so I think that's what keeps a lot of them away. They just feel like they're sitting at the table with their persecutor.
I do think there are sort of steps that we can take and the church can take, right? Like we have to engage in a radical form of truth-telling then, right? Like we have to open archives.
Absolutely.
Like we have to open records. Like, reconciliation does not come without the truth. And then next is justice. And so we can't do any of that before. But for me, if it's the first response when you hear these stories is, I couldn't believe that, as opposed to, well, that's what the church has been doing for quite some time. Like, I guess for me, until, you know, Pope Francis says Black Lives Matter and, you know, apologizes for the church's sort of 4 centuries of profit from chattel slavery and all this, and exploitation and colonialism, people are going to be like, okay, the Catholic Church is primarily at X, Y, and Z. So, but I think it has to start with the truth, whatever we do.
My question is directed to any of the speakers who'd like to respond. My name's Joanne Bray. In March of this year, I happened to be one of 30 delegates to the UN as a member of an NGO. Clearly at the time there was a platform of 12 issues. One of them was violence against women. What I noticed was, in contrast to Beijing in 1995, there was barely any presence of Catholic women's organizations who addressed the issue of violence. When I listen to your stories, what I wonder is there any opportunity, either as individuals or organizations, to represent a Catholic woman's voice in the context of the UN NGOs specifically?
I'll be happy to tackle that one, because we did take our case, obviously, to the UN. Yeah, I think what was most curiously absent, and we really did invite it and welcomed it, was any lack of presence from the religious to step up to the plate and help us out with this cause. So absolutely, I think that's imperative. I know Justice for Magdalene's would.
As far as I know, there are a number of religious congregations and many sisters from India who are representing religious congregations there at the UN, but they're not taking up issues within the church. And let me tell you categorically, from my own experience, when you work with the church, you have to be seen to be loyal to the church. So when you take up issues outside, it should be issues outside the church. So I wonder how many, like I said, how many religious women, and I know that in India they don't have the guts like the LCWR here, would take up such an issue at the UN. There we have so many other issues that overwhelm us, like poverty and societal violence against women, and, but not anything to do with the church. There is complete silence over there. And that's where I think we have to raise a global voice. This issue of violence against women in the church is silence. Even now we talk about violence against women, children, but not against women, which is, I think, far greater, because spiritual abuse occurs when violence, sex abuse of women happen in the church. So, but how do you deal with it? How do you break the silence? Because all the time, people who bring up this subject are silenced themselves.
Thank you. I'm an Australian woman from Women in the Australian Church, and I wanted to ask on behalf and standing with our sister from Bangladesh, who spoke a little bit earlier in this question time, how can we, who live in countries that have very strong human rights charters and find it difficult enough to get a voice for women, women in the church who've been abused, even though we have royal commissions and we have various institutions, how can we ensure that the voice of our sister from Bangladesh, who came here on her own bat, with her own finance, difficult for her, she has no solidarity at home, how can we take her story and ensure that it's included in our documented stories of sexual abuse? That's my question. Can we ensure that they will be included?
I'm not sure we can ensure it, but I think we're inspiring 500 people now, so we're doing our best.
So invite, rather than ensure.
I think that, you know, all of us have had our eyes opened, even if we knew something about the situations, and I hope, that was going to be my closing remark, that we were going to walk out of here feeling energized. What a fitting way to be ending this very inspiring group of stories. again, to refer to Mary Hunt yesterday getting us started at that academic seminar where she said that the urgency of injustice permits none of us to stand by. And I think that after what we've heard today, we all go out with a renewed sense that we cannot stand by. Whatever little thing we need to do, we will take it up and we will do it. So we thank Barbara and Mari and Virginia and Shannon so much for their sharing their expertise and their stories. And we want to give them a really big hand.